Have you ever felt like the so-called experts are lying to you? Well, it's not just you. Believe it or not, but many experts, and especially economists, are knowingly lying to the general public. Now, this was talked about in a research paper a few years back, and it's safe to say that it reveals a lot about how they're pulling the wool over our eyes. Today, we're going to summarize this paper and tell you exactly what it means for you and for the markets. The paper that we'll be summarising is titled Should Economists Deceive? Pro-Social Lying, Paternalism and the Ben Bernanke Problem. It was written back in 2020 by George DiMartino, a professor at the University of Denver. We'll leave a link to it in the description, but we will warn you that it's quite a dense read. As such, we'll be keeping things as simple as possible over here and giving you just the juicy details without the need to keep a dictionary at hand. Anyways, the paper begins with an abstract and an introduction, which explain that, despite it being recognised as vital that economists speak the truth, the reality is that a lot of the time, they don't. In fact, the author includes a quote from economist Anatol Kaletsky, which states, quote, "Just as James Bond has a licence to kill, central bankers possess a licence to lie." I'm not sure that's quite cool enough to build a 27-film franchise off the back of, but it makes you think nonetheless. Now, the lying in question here pertains to pro-social lying, basically telling lies about the economy in order to create a better outcome for society. Deception, but for the greater good, if you will.
What about the greater good?
The greater good. How can this be for the greater good?
The thing is, while the intentions behind pro-social lying by economists might be for a better outcome, the fact of the matter is that what economists say about the economy will ultimately affect it. To use an extreme example here, can you imagine a respected economist saying everything's going to zero? It would create utter chaos. This means that economists have to be very careful with what they say, and this can sometimes mean staying overly optimistic, even when the situation at hand might not be so positive. Therefore, their statements shouldn't be taken as gospel or as a real economic forecast. Oh, and by the way, if you're enjoying the video so far, help a guy called Guy out by smashing that like button, hitting that subscribe button, and showing that notification bell who's boss. Anyway, the author then points out that some philosophers believe that pro-social lying is actually a necessity, and others not so much. On one hand, lying can be warranted if it's for the public's best interests, but on the other hand, there isn't really a limit to what economists can or can't lie about. There's no real rulebook, no internal debates, and no looking back at history to determine where the boundaries lie. It's entirely left to the economist's judgment to determine what is acceptable and what isn't. That in itself can be a scary enough thought. However, economists will tell pro-social lies to prevent further disruption to the financial system. As we've seen over the years, what an economist says can, and often does, determine which way a market can swing, and there are people who will exploit this information. Hold up a second there, Guy. Sorry to interrupt, folks, but I just wanted to very quickly tell you about the Coin Bureau Deals page. Now, this is the place where we have put together some of the very best deals and promos in all of crypto. So you can think things like exchange sign-up bonuses, trading fee discounts, and money off of hardware wallets, and much, much more besides. So if you want to check that out, coinbureau.com/deals is the place to go, or you can just use the link in the description of this video down below. Thanks very much, and now back to you, Guy. So, as the author of this paper points out, quote, economists tend to skip over the real-world complications and nuances while downplaying the diversity of intellectual frameworks. By leaving out certain details, economists remove the opportunity for market participants to cause havoc in the markets. Now, this causes the author to raise a few questions. For starters, is this as it should be? Can a compelling case be made for economic exceptionalism? Is economics unlike other fields in ways that make paternalistic coercion, through lying, ethically appropriate? Well, to help find the answers to these questions, the author examines the timeline for what's known as the Ben Bernanke Problem. For those unfamiliar, Ben Bernanke was a leading American economist who served as the 14th chairman of the Federal Reserve between 2006 and 2014. That same position that our buddy Jerome Powell fills today. Anyhow, Ben Bernanke presents an example of pro-social lying that most economists would agree was warranted. That's because his position was critical during the build-up to the 2008 financial crisis. It's worth noting here, by the way, that the author points out that the case for lying doesn't just apply to central bankers, and that the same arguments can be made for economists in every sector around the world. Anyway, despite worsening economic conditions, Bernanke's tone in the early months of the financial crisis was increasingly positive. On the 15th of May 2008, he spoke at the 44th Annual Conference on Bank Structure and Competition, where he was very open about the potential of financial risks. He explained that financial turmoil had started the previous summer and that this had raised questions about the regulation of institutions and their ability to maintain financial stability. He pointed out that increasing housing valuations were disguising a rise in less than ideal mortgages, saying that while house prices increased, the equity of borrowers increased and they were often able to refinance into more sustainable mortgages. However, when prices went down, people found themselves trapped with mortgages they couldn't afford. Now, obviously, this was a cause for concern. So, you'd think that when the situation got worse, Bernanke would have had an even more gloomy outlook. Well, he didn't. On the 3rd of June 2008, just 2 weeks after that conference, Bernanke reported to the International Monetary Conference. He said that the economic situation reflected the unwinding of the housing and credit booms, and that there was continued pressure from the global demand for commodities. He explained that the Fed had eased monetary policy substantially in order to address the rapidly deteriorating conditions. He even said that, quote, "For now, policy seems well positioned to promote moderate growth and stability over time." Then, that same week, on the 9th of June, Bernanke discussed financial uncertainty as if it were nothing more than a momentary hindrance. In fact, he began his discussion by talking about the prospects for growth. He said that despite the rise in the unemployment rate, data suggested that it would only have a modest effect on the economy. He then acknowledged that economic activity in that quarter looked weak, but insisted that the longer-term risks had diminished over the last month or so. He even suggested that, thanks to fiscal stimulus, the remainder of 2008 should see some progress in the repair of financial markets. Although he did again raise housing as a concern, along with the rise in energy costs. In July, Bernanke presented the Fed's semi-annual report on monetary and economic policy to the House Financial Services Committee, where he assured everyone that government-sponsored enterprises, or GSEs, were in no danger of failing. This was obviously untrue because 2 weeks after that, Warren Buffett signalled his concerns about GSEs, and just a month later, the government ended up bailing 2 of them out, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Now, obviously, the rest of 2008 ended up being pretty damn grim, particularly after Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy in September and triggered a global panic, marking the peak of the financial crisis. However, the author notes that during the build-up to this crash, Bernanke's speech became notably more strategic and performative, rather than descriptive. Now, it's obvious that Bernanke was right to deceive. Despite the financial system crumbling around him, he displayed confidence. In that sense, his comments were not truthful, they were deceptive, but this was necessary to prevent the crisis from worsening. The author notes that here, and in other similar situations, deception takes the form of strategic speaking. In terms of central bankers, their speech can be viewed as forward guidance for the economy. This opens the door to further pro-social lying, even in non-critical moments. That's because central bankers can use strategic speaking to influence the economy, both privately and publicly, to produce a particular result. This includes lawmakers, investors, influential economic actors, and the general public. The question is, how much influence does this strategic forward guidance have? Now, the purpose of strategic speaking is not to inform, but to bring about a variety of effects. For example, central bankers could say that the economy is stable, not necessarily because they believe it's true, but because it's a method of maintaining that stability. The author notes that a central banker's strategic speech is ethically complex for a number of reasons. First, the truth of these strategic statements depends on their effects, which can't be known for certain at the time. That's why when a central banker says that the economy is stable, what they're really saying is, please act in the belief that the markets are stable. If they literally said this, it would cause disbelief and panic, which would ironically cause instability. Secondly, as we discussed earlier, pro-social lying is both coercive and paternalistic, as they intend to alter behaviours based on deception rather than discussion. Therefore, it denies a person of the right to make well-informed decisions of their own. This is an instance of the dirty hands defence, where an agent will disregard moral values to bring about a more important social good. However, the defence of this lying must demonstrate that the goal justifies this ethical disregard and must be within the economic professional's authority. This was the case with medical professionals that we mentioned earlier. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, this deception raises further questions. Are other economists licensed to deceive in the same way? Will the more ethically minded economists need to continue these lies to avoid causing economic confusion? And what types of lies are even permissible in the first place? The author points out that, as philosopher Cicela Bock warns us, deception regarding the level of uncertainty is one of the main ways to gain power over the choices of the deceived. This is something the author notes as probably the most common form of deception in economics, and one that shouldn't be taken lightly. Naturally, this only raises more questions. What other ways can economists deceive? Would it be acceptable for an economist to exaggerate the good of their policies and the negatives of others? What if an economic consultant deliberately cherry-picks the information to present to others while deliberately leaving out other policy options? And what if the economists tamper with statistical findings but fail to report it? Honestly, we've almost got enough questions for a game of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, albeit a rather highbrow one. But it's that last question that is arguably the most concerning. That's because a government economist is responsible for presenting data for a whole range of things, including consumer confidence, job creation, inflation, unemployment, trade balances, and many more economic indicators besides. Therefore, would it be acceptable for government economists to misreport this data if they believed it would promote a more beneficial objective? As the author points out, you only have to look at China, which is widely believed to routinely push fabricated data in order to sustain foreign investment and political and economic stability. The author speculates that economists would be disturbed by the prospect of central bankers and government economists fabricating data in this way, even if it were done for the right reasons. Again, though, this raises the question of where we draw the line. Well, as the author somewhat bleakly puts it, quote, "I am aware of no viable ethical standards that supports the drawing of those lines." Nice. No matter, though, because it looks like economists have figured out where to draw those lines for themselves. That's because, according to the author, economists feel validated and empowered when they're in on the lie, but they're intolerant if they're the ones being duped. Ah, the irony. Instead, they'd prefer a free rider status where they can enjoy the benefits of lying, but without the risk of being lied to. In other words, being a part of an elite club that has access to insider knowledge. The thing is, as tempting as it is to think that this elite club only provides risks from high-profile economists, the fact is that even lower-level economists can affect the lives of thousands, if not millions of people, all at once. Now, the author says that during his research, he's interviewed many economists. A recurring theme with many of them was that they were pressed into doing work that was deeply inefficient or even completely false. Many of them were expected to produce reports that supported decisions that had already been made. The author notes an example of one economist who is a member of the Council of Economic Advisers, which advises the President of the United States. This person was instructed to produce an estimate of the balance of payments impact of a West Coast dock strike for a court injunction set to take place the following morning. They were told that the legally specified basis was a demonstration of a national emergency. No pressure then, eh? Now, in this instance, the economist was pushed to produce what's known as Ersatz economic analysis. For reference, the word Ersatz comes from the German word for substitute or imitation. So, in other words, it was deemed necessary to use fake analysis. Knowing this analysis is fake makes it almost impossible to maintain trust. This is especially true when it's work that the economists themselves don't believe in. However, this person wasn't the only one. The author also notes that several interviewees had stories of their own where they had to sacrifice truth in order to alter the behavior of other economists and market participants. Heck, the author even says that some of them literally told him that you can never trust a government economist or any economic consultant. In some cases, these economists say that they were, quote, forced to speak more loudly on issues than they otherwise would have, in order to sustain the support of their funders, or in an effort to fire back at other economists at the other end of the political spectrum. The author concludes by saying that speaking to these economists reveals that deception is not only occasional, but it's actually routine. The problem is, if the profession continues to tolerate lying, it risks losing its legitimacy, even among other economists. In fact, the author points out that it could lead to hostility, and if that were to happen, the profession would deserve not to be trusted. Now, the author wraps up this paper with a few closing thoughts on what can be derived from it. To start, though, he begins with what we can't derive. While it's hoped that we can determine a clear line between what makes pro-social lying legitimate or not, we simply can't. It remains entirely up to the profession to decide what's acceptable and what isn't. He then raises his own concerns. He notes that when an economist claims to lie for the good of others, they presume to know what it is that others value. He then reiterates that deception denies people of their own autonomy and erodes trust between non-economists and even fellow members of the profession. He finishes by saying that deception in economics is a huge contributor to the loss of trust in expertise and is a common feature of the problems with politics. And this rejection of expertise has even proved to be catastrophic, particularly with the pandemic. Recall that this paper was written in 2020. So that's what the paper has to say. But what does this mean for the markets, or indeed the average person? Well, in terms of what could change, not much. That's because it's clear that both high-profile and low-profile economists have the ability to manipulate the economy as they see fit, and that's arguably one of the most powerful tools to have at one's disposal. The likelihood of this changing anytime soon is virtually non-existent. But what it does mean is that we now know to interpret an economist's pronouncements with greater scrutiny. So the next time Jerome Powell says, "everything's fine," you'll know that this could mean that actually everything's not fine, and he's just trying to keep things together. Seriously, folks, take everything that people like this say with a massive pinch of salt. What is clear is that the level of trust that people have in these experts has collapsed and continues to decline. While economists echo the words of Margaret Thatcher in saying that, quote, "there is no alternative," people are waking up to the fact that this is far from the truth. While it is clear that pro-social lying can achieve immediate results, this is a very short-term way of thinking. That's because this deception can cause its own problems. Working with skewed data will naturally throw up skewed results, and logically this can't be sustainable in the long run. This means that either the financial system collapses, which could actually be the lesser of two evils, because the alternative is that society breaks, and the very people who economists deem fit to deceive push back and start a rebellion. At that point, it won't matter what the profession says. It'll be too little, too late. But let's hope that this somewhat nightmarish future doesn't come to fruition. With a bit of luck, economists will read the room, see the angry faces staring back at them, and start telling it like it really is. Okay, folks, that's all for today's video. So if you found it interesting, let us know by smashing that like button. If you want to get more interesting content like this, subscribe to the channel and ping that notification bell. And if you know someone who would find this video interesting as well, take a second to share it with them. As always, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time. This is Guy, signing off.